So just one example of many. Charles, again, if I may, referred to his time in the Galapagos Islands, circled here by the circle on the left. Darwin was very interested in the fact that all the different species on the islands were different from, but similar to, species on the mainland of South America. At the same time, he was interested very much in the species of the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of Africa. Like the Galapagos species, they were different from each other, but similar to the forms on the mainland of Africa. What interested Darwin, too, was the fact that the Galapagos Islands are not very much like the mainland of South America, climatically or ecologically speaking. Nor are the Cape Verde Islands much like the mainland of Africa. In fact, the Cape Verde Islands, Darwin thought, were quite like the Galapagos Islands. And yet the species on the Galapagos Islands didn't look anything like the species on the Cape Verde Islands. Again, they look like the forms on the mainland. Darwin thought that he asked himself, why would God have created species on the Cape Verde Islands, which resemble very much ecologically the Galapagos Islands, that species that resemble those on the mainland of Africa, instead of putting the species there that resemble those on the Galapagos Islands, and similarly for the Galapagos Islands. Darwin's only way of figuring out why God would have done this was because it simply pleased him to do so. There was no way to bring his benevolence or wisdom into this explanation. Now, I need to go into a little detail about the process by which species are transformed. Again, Darwin's preferred explanation of why we see the forms we do in the Galapagos Islands is that they resemble the forms on the mainland of South America, presumably because some organisms from the mainland colonized the islands, the Galapagos Islands, and once that colony was established there, it was transformed over time. And I need to say a little bit about this process by which species are transformed over time. I need to go into a little detail because, as we'll see, the devil is in the details. Darwin believed that species were transformed by a process analogous to that by which breeders modified domesticated species, as he just told us when he started thinking about the problem of the origin of species. He had in mind that he might learn something from the breeder's art. It's also worthwhile to say a bit about the breeding of domesticated species, since Darwin later makes a theological point using examples from the history of breeding. Take pigeons that Darwin enjoyed studying so much. Darwin goes on and on about pigeons and the origin. You may be very disappointed if you just pick up the origin and start reading that it's all about pigeons. No other species is discussed as much as pigeons. All the different sorts of pigeons that one sees at fairs and exhibitions are descendants, Darwin argued, of a common form. How have those various breeds been created? Well, a breeder notices that one or more of the pigeons in his keeping has a particular trait that he finds useful or just plain entertaining. He wishes that all his pigeons had that trait. So he chooses those particular pigeons to be the parents of the next generation, and he eats the rest. English will eat anything as long as it's boiled long enough. Hopefully, the trait in question will be inherited by the offspring. If so, then over time, the pigeon breeder's stock will be transformed. What was once a rare trait will become common. At some point, much to the breeder's delight, pigeons in his stock may be born with an enhanced version of the trait. He selects those to be the parents of the next generation, and so on until one breeder or group of breeders has created pouter pigeons, as those on the left, with their exaggerated breasts. Another breeder, a group of breeders, has created fan-tailed pigeons with their exaggerated backsides. Another group of breeders has created tumbling pigeons, as those in the bottom right corner. They may look very plain and simple to you until you see them in their acrobatic flying. They come in two kinds, some somersault backwards, some somersault forwards. That's evolution by artificial selection. Evolution by natural selection is, I want you to listen to me. Artificial evolution by natural selection is similar but different. In wild as well as domesticated species, new traits or different versions of previously existing traits arise from time to time. And in wild as well as domesticated species, these new traits are often inheritable. In the case of evolution by artificial selection, however, the important new traits are those of use to the breeder, while in the case of evolution by natural selection, the important new traits are those of use to the organisms that possess them. If an organism is born with a new trait that renders it more likely to survive and reproduce, then that trait will increase in frequency over the course of generations, and if the trait is inheritable. Thus, in order to explain the widespread appropriateness of organic form, one does not, after all, have to choose between God's direct involvement and an inconceivably lucky accident. It was, from Darwin's point of view, a grander view of God's role, that he, God, perhaps created a few original forms of life, but also designed the laws of nature so that new species would come into being without any further intervention. As Darwin concluded The Origin, this is the very last passage of the book, and I've always wanted to hear you read this yourself.
There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers. Having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms, or into one. And that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved.
Thank you, Charles, but if only theology and natural history could be so simply reconciled. A very thorny theological problem quickly arose in Darwin's thought. It concerned a particular gap in his account of evolution. And that gap had to do with the question, how do the new traits or the new versions of previously existing traits that are selected themselves arise? What accounts for the fact that a new trait or a new version of a trait arises in one individual and not another, or in one generation rather than another? Darwin initially thought that some sort of change in the environment in one generation affects the reproductive organisms of some but not all the members of a species, so that their offspring are born with new traits or new versions of previously existing traits. But extensive investigation turned up no such environmental factors. The origin of variation seemed unpredictable. For his part, Darwin attributed to what he called chance or accidental variation, chance or accident. Of course, it was not from Darwin's point of view chance or an accident that a useful variation, once it had arisen, would increase in frequency over the course of generations. That was a matter of natural selection. It was, however, from Darwin's point of view, a matter of chance or accident that a useful rather than a disadvantageous variation of this sort or that would initially arise in this organism or that. Even this much chance or accident proved too much to swallow by several influential naturalists of Darwin's time, who encouraged him in private and in print that so long as the origin of variation remained a mystery, he should attribute it appropriately to God. This would not only plug a hole in his theory, but would also have a theologically enormous benefit over attributing the origin of variation to chance. On Darwin's account, one could predict this much, that organisms of all types would have traits and combinations of traits that were useful for their survival and reproduction. But one could not predict what specific forms of life would evolve by natural selection. Knowing only that useful variations will be accumulated by natural selection does not allow one to predict the evolution of, for example, Venus flytraps or seahorses. One could only predict the existence of these specific forms of life if one knew the particular variations that would arise among their ancestors and the order in which they would arise to be subsequently accumulated by natural selection. If one couldn't predict the evolution of Venus flytraps and seahorses, then how could one possibly predict the evolution of humans? And here, of course, was the real rub.